How medieval poets chose to introduce their work varies from poem to poem. In the alliterative revival, we find poets who celebrate the matter of Britain. We find poets who celebrate the poetic voice. And we find poets with a religious angle about society. Here I'm going to read to you three introductions, my three translated works of poems from the Alliterative Revival of the 14th century. And we're going to begin with the earliest, which is from the romance of William and the Werewolf, otherwise known as William of Palerne. This was translated from the Old French in around 1350 and translated from a rhyming, Old French rhyming verse into Middle English alliterative longline. So it was quite a sophisticated translation method. The beginning of the poem in the Middle English is missing, but the Old French original has the source, and in my translation I have translated that into modern English and then converted it into the alliterative form to match with the rest of my translation to give a continuous whole which has the same meaning throughout. So let's look at the opening lines from the romance of William and the Werewolf as our starting point in the alliterative revival. Let no soul be silent, or keep a secret if he knows of something which he thinks that will please, but which he fails to recount or relate by the telling. For it is truly to his loss that he hides all he knows, retaining all that is rich, deigning ever to release it in the presence of all people and giving them pleasure. Thus I will tell what I know, and do so most willingly, such that all who are wicked will weaken and wilt, and that all who will hasten to gather and hear me shall learn only of good that comes from such telling. For wisdom unheard and hushed, hidden within, is wholly the same, in my humble opinion, as treasure trussed up, entrapped in a chest, of no gain or advantage to any living soul, for the hour after hour it is hard hasped away. So it is with sweet knowledge, if shackled within. Thus I will tell all, and leave nothing concealed, that it pleases all people, and brings pleasure to me, according to my mind and what I can remember. In respect of a romance I wish to relate, that in legend occurred long ago in Apulia, to a lord of that land, who ruled as its king. So here the poet is saying he knows of a story, he wants to tell it to us, he doesn't want the secret concealed, he wants all the goodness of the poem to come out. Why? Because this is a poem about good leadership and how incorrect or flawed leadership can cause huge problems, ultimately for leaders, because if you betray those you serve, they will ultimately rise up against you. And this is quite an interesting poem because it's written in 1350, and what we're seeing here in England is the first phase of the Black Death in 1348, 1349, and in 1361 it came again, which curiously is the time of the death of the patron of the romance of William and the Werewolf, Humphrey de Bohun, who died in that second outbreak. Whether he died of the plague is uncertain, but nonetheless, it's quite interesting that here was a poem talking about the need for good leadership, good lordship, in a time of social change, probably engendered by the Black Death and the fact that it spared no one in its wake as it crossed lands and continents, wreaking havoc on society. So, we've looked at the romance of William and the Werewolf. Now let's look at King Arthur's death, the Alliterative Morte Arthure. This is written in the North Country. Quite interesting. You will hear a different form of language much more alliterative and robust. The Romance of William the Werewolf is gentler. It was written in, or what survives is in a West Midlands dialect, and it actually has quite, as you read through it, it actually has quite a soft tone. Whereas the Alliterative Morte Arthure, the Alliterative Morte, King Arthur's death, has a much harsher delivery. But its opening is interesting. We are told it has a sort of religious opening. It makes us reflect why these things are happening, and what are we in some way, have we moved away from God's word? What must we do? So let's begin the Alliterative Morte. Now, great glorious God, through the grace of himself and the precious prayers of his priceless mother, shield us from sinful works and from a shameful death, so that by his grace and guidance we govern ourselves in this wretched world, and through virtuous living and care we reach his court, the kingdom of heaven, when our soul shall part asunder from the body, ever to be and bide in bliss with himself. And show me how to weave some words at this time, that be neither void nor vain, but will venerate him, and which will please and profit all people who hear them. You who likes to listen, or who loves to hear of elders of old time and of their wondrous deeds, how they were loyal to their religion and loved God Almighty, hearken high unto me, and hold yourself still, and I shall tell you a tale that is both true and noble of the royal ranks of the Round Table, who were champions of chivalry, the choicest of chieftains, both cautious in their works and wise men of arms, doughty in their doings and dreading of shame, kind men and courteous, knowing of courtly ways, how they won through warring much wondrous honour, slew Lucius the loathsome that was lord of Rome, and conquered his kingdom through craft of arms. Hearken now hitherward, and hear this story. So this is interesting, isn't it? So we're told this is about respect for God, knowing God's kingdom, how we can abide in his bliss, how we will ultimately enter paradise. And yet he wants to tell us about the Round Table, about King Arthur and these champions of chivalry, kind men of courteous, knowing of courtly ways. So it's sort of ambivalent, really. One is sort of religious and the other is sort of romance. It's sort of blending both together. Now, as King Arthur's death proceeds, we move away from that. We return to it at the end, and we are drawn to reflect on how the deeds of men ultimately are transient and temporary in this world. But nonetheless, the introduction is religious, and then we move into this courtly and actually quite martial story of how King Arthur, probably through pride, went abroad, destroyed Lucius, but then it got to his head, and he started to besiege Rome, and then he was called back to Britain, where he faces Mordred, who's taken over his land while he's been away, and we have this magnificent battle at the end. But it's interesting, isn't it, that sort of compare that introduction to the one at the Romance of William and the Werewolf. And then we have another, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. What an introduction this one is. This is curious. This relates distinctly to the matter of Britain and how Britain was founded. So when you think about this is sort of written 1375, 1400. So we've got this essence of perhaps the impact of the 100 Years' War, this notion of English nationality, but notwithstanding, we're talking here about Britain. Britain as a concept, not as a kingdom, but as a sort of romantic land, Albion off the shore of Europe. And indeed, in King Arthur's death, he refers to Britain as well, whereas William and the Werewolf, of course, is written in English, but it relates to a story in Naples and Rome and Sicily. So let's hear the introduction to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, different again. So, when the siege and the assault was ceased at Troy, and that borough broken and burned to brands and ashes. The traitor who wrought there every trace of treason was tried for his treachery, the truest on earth. Thus it was Aeneas, the Lord, and his high kind, who then oppressed provinces with power to become the wealthiest of the wealthy in the Western Isles. Romulus the rich raises Rome swiftly, and quickly begets that borough with brilliance, and with his name he names it, which it still has. Titius in Tuscany begins to build towers. Langobard in Lombardy lifts up homesteads, and there, over the French flood, Felix Brutus, on many banks full broad, Britain he sets within, where war and wrack and wonder have since occurred therein, and oft both bliss and blunder full swift have shifted since. And when that rich noble begat this place Britain, bold bred they were there, and lovers of battle, who many times that came to pass brought trouble. Famed feats have fallen in its lands more than often than in any other that I know, ever since that very time. But of all the kings that built here in Britain, the highest was Arthur, as I have heard tell. So an adventure from here I aim to disclose, that astounds some men still, and grips them fast. A stunning adventure from the legends of Arthur. If you will listen to this tale but one little while, I shall tell it as tightly as I in turn heard it by tongue. As it's been set and cast into a story stout and strong, with linked letters thus held fast in this land it's been so long. Linked letters thus held fast. He's talking about alliteration, the alliterative form, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, really, of those examples of this form which survive, is the apogee of the type. It is a magnificent poem from beginning to end, exquisitely crafted. But yet he begins with this story of Britain, how it began, and it comes from Troy, and then Brutus came and took over. They crossed the French flood, the English Channel, landed here, and created this wonderful name, this description of Britain, this land of bliss and blunder. And well, what a better way of describing this island. Bliss and blunder was then, was still, is still, will always be. People muddling about just to get through their lives and get things done. And then he talks about them being bold bred and lovers of battle. A martial society, hints there of King Arthur's death, famed feats in this land. And then the highest of all of these kings, the most well known, was Arthur. And so the poet draws us in, telling us first about the land of Britain, and then zooming in his camera to focus on Arthur, and then we're launched into this magnificent story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. All of these poems are magnificent in their own way, and they're there to be read for their poetry, but also for what they contain, for their story about society, about how people should behave, about the laws which govern them. And you'll see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and also in King Arthur's death in particular, this word surquedry, overweening pride or arrogance. And this, of course, is any leader exhibiting that particular trait, treated with contempt by the poets in medieval society, as indeed we should treat them today. And there are many such people who still believe that they have the right to govern with arrogance, with surquedry, overweening pride, that they are always right. But as each of these three poems tells us in their own separate ways, this is not the way for leadership to be undertaken. This is not the way to bring people with you. Surquedry is the enemy of society. Surquedry is a trait of a failed leader. I hope you've enjoyed this brief discussion about the introductions to these 3 magnificent poems. All my books are available online through all good bookshops or direct from me at Mythical Britain. Thank you very much for listening.